Welcome to our webinar on soil health and biodiversity. This is part of a series of webinars that Durham University is running in the rundown to COP26. And the series is supported by the Durham Energy Institute. You can see Lynn Gibson's avatar here with the DEI logo. The series are all available online. So they've been running since March and they run on the 5 themes that COP26 is running on. This month, we're looking at nature. The series are called STEAM for ACE. So that's a lot of acronyms I've just thrown at you. I'm sure everybody knows what COP stands for. COP26 is the climate change conference that's running in the UK in the first 2 weeks of November. And all eyes are going to be on the UK, of course. But COP15 is actually running this week online, but based in China. And COP15 is the 15th International Conference on Biodiversity. So that's why we're running this webinar on soil health and biodiversity this week. So the other acronyms, ACE, stands for Action for Climate Emergency. And obviously in the rundown to COP26, we're all interested to make sure that our governments actually take action and put into place strict measures for us to achieve the ambitious targets set at the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015. STEAM, S-T-E-A-M, stands for sciences, not just the physical sciences, but the social sciences as well, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. And it is, of course, all of the disciplines that we need to address global challenges, such as the loss of biodiversity and climate change. So this month, our 4 webinars, as I said, are all based around nature and nature-based solutions, and they're all on soil. And I make no apologies for the fact that they're all on soil, because soil is the Cinderella of all resources, water, air, and soil is definitely bottom of the pile. It's not glamorous, but it does underpin all life. And that's what we're going to hear more about today. In fact, the UN have said that healthy soils are essential if we're to meet the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that they set in 2015. So the format of today's webinar is that it is a conversation. And so it's being recorded so everybody can watch it, but it is meant to be raising awareness and questions in you, the audience. So the panelists, who will introduce themselves after I finish this introduction, will be kicking off, talking about what soil health is. But and that's just for 20, 30 minutes. And then we're going to be all eyes on the chat. Please make sure you've got your chat function open so you can put your questions in as we're talking, address them to everyone, and then everybody can see your questions. It'll hopefully fire thoughts in everyone else. And we will spend the final 20 to 30 minutes answering your questions as panelists, and getting you to switch on your cameras and speak to us if you want to, or you can just put it in the chat and you don't have to switch your camera or your microphone on. For the first part of the session, please keep your microphones off so that we don't get interference. So introductions. I am Karen Johnson and I'm a professor of environmental engineering. I worked in the water industry in London for several years before I came back up to the northeast of England, where I am now at Durham University, and I made the crossover not only into academia, but also into the wholly more complex subject of soil as opposed to water. And my research is about sustainable soil improvement technologies. So basically, I'm interested in rebuilding our degraded soils, digging organic matter and minerals into the soil in order to allow the microbiome, the living parts of the soil, to rebuild the soil structure and improve ecosystem services. And by ecosystem services, I mean water storage, carbon storage, supporting our built infrastructure, providing green space, and the foundation of human health. So I'm going to hand over directly to Professor Diana Wall, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Karen. I'm Wayne. It's good to be here. It's a little intimidating because I don't know if we've got a lot of experts, and I'm just hoping if you're an expert in this area of soil biodiversity or can add something to the conversation, you'll kind of come in and help me out. And I don't know all the soils in England, for example, or in the UK, or let alone in Colorado, where I'm from. So I'm Diana Wall, and I'm at Colorado State University, and that's in Fort Collins, Colorado. So we're right at the foothills of the prairie that stretches to the Mississippi, and we're at the bottom of the Rockies, or about 4,000 feet, a couple of thousand meters. And I'm saying that because today we got our first cold snow. But we're still thinking about soils and soil health, and it's a lot of arid. It's very arid here. And I just kind of wanted to give you first, before I launch into, because when I start talking about how important I think soil biodiversity is, I may never come back to this. I thought I'd just tell you how I got involved in this. When I was in graduate school, I actually had a professor who said, oh, you've been looking at microbes. How about looking at some parasites of plants? And I thought, whoa, that is really cool. And they were in soil. And they were nematodes, small little microscopic, about as big as your eyelash. And you could see through these little tiny worms. I mean, I could see their esophagus. It was like you were watching them breathe. They were very clear, and you could see differences. And I was astounded that here is an organism with a stylet that it's like a hypodermic needle, and it could penetrate into plant roots. And then I could see over time the plant root change. The growth of the plant was diminished. And I thought, this small little bitty thing I knew nothing about, when I first started college, here it was. And so I went and got a degree in plant pathology, studying lots of nematodes in deserts. I've spent a lot of time working in Antarctica because there's very few species in the ice-free soils there. And then I got interested in what's the food chain like here? What is the food web that supports us all? We've got earthworms at the top, say, and is it only roots that are feeding the carbon to this soil food web? Or is it the dead leaves and the dead bodies? How many links are there in this complexity of a food web? And basically, when we come back to it, when we talk about soil health and soils and reforming soils, the idea that biota are really important, the biodiversity, the animals, the microbes, the fungi, the protists, you could just go on and on, are all doing lots of different tasks, kind of like an assembly line of tearing down things or dissolving things and putting nutrients back in the soil for more growth. And I think that it's been recognized, at least I know from reading, that in I guess the 1940s, a guy named Hans Jenny said the 5 factors that form soil are going to be, the geology that's there in a place, the relief, whether you've got mountains or valleys or that kind of thing, climate, of course, and how long it takes. But there's only one little tiny word that says biota. And biota are really essential to, moving nutrients through soil. And I thought I'd just give you, I'm going on, Lynn, you can stop me, but just a couple of examples. We talked about ecosystem services. And I hope that when you eat your dinner tonight, if you have any rice or vegetables, you'll think about the nutrition that's in them. And that has to do also with that tiny little word of what forms soil, turning over nutrients, the biota turning over nutrients that go into the plants we eat, whether it's rice or bread or whatever. They can be poor nutrients. So that's a problem. And then there are things like drinking water. We know that biota are important, particularly microbes, fungi. I mean, fungi have these direct connections between plants. They do so much to pull out the nutrients. But you have water that has to be cleaned. And basically, there's a food web. There are different food webs that are involved in that. And then I guess the last thing, of course, that's really important to the COP26 is that we're sequestering and storing carbon, and it takes a long time. for these food webs to do that. But some of these, not only the microbes, the fungi, everything that's involved, they're animals and invertebrates that are moving pieces of leaves, making avenues like roadways through the soil, and making the soil, the microbes make it sticky, and animals own up the food chain, eat each other and eat down to that sticky aggregates, get stickier, and then we have some carbon stored. And so I'm very interested in soil health globally. I think there are different definitions of it, so we have to be careful that I'm not talking about the US version of what soil health is. But I do think it's just so, what Lynn said at the start, it underpins the types of plants we want to see above ground. And I think that's a good time for me to end. My knowledge is kind of over right there.
You're so modest, Diana. World-leading expert on biodiversity in soils. Wayne, I'll let you introduce yourself, but I must say before you introduce yourself, Wayne is got a poorly voice at the moment, so he might not be speaking as much as myself and Diana. Diana has also suffered with a sore throat these last few months, but Wayne, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Thanks, Diana. I will keep it pretty short because, as you can hear, I sound pretty hoarse. But my name is Wayne Dawson, and I'm an associate professor in plant ecology in the biosciences department in Durham, at Durham University. And most of my research is really focused on trying to understand how plants interact with one another in communities, and how those interactions of plants in communities are going to change in response to different elements of environmental change. So a lot of my work is primarily focused on invasive plants and the impacts that invasive plants have on resident plant communities that they invade. But I'm increasingly interested in understanding how plant communities respond to climate change, and that also includes invasive plants. And I guess ever since I did my master's at Lancaster University, when I studied soil ecology in particular, I've been interested in trying to understand how those interactions between soil biota, and in particular soil microbes, how those interactions with soil microbes and plants, how those interactions shape the plant communities that we see above ground, and how those plant communities are going to change with ongoing environmental changes. And I'll stop there before I lose my voice completely.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a distinct possibility. Thanks so much, Wayne and Diana. Mm-hmm. So I loved hearing, Diana, what you were saying about the creatures creating the roadways through the soil. And some of the work that I've come across recently about it being the soil microbiome creating the soil structure, so that sort of soil is living in itself. Maybe we could start this meeting off by saying, why is soil health important? You know, why is it important? Who wants to kick off with that?
Well, I'll start to save Wayne a little bit, and he'll get to the actual things we eat. I think it's important. I mean, it's been shown, there's some studies, really just brilliant work across Europe, for example, by a lot of people of different disciplines looking at intensive management and kind of moderate management and more sustainable management. And they have shown a decrease in not only the number of species across Europe with intensive management. So just the tilling of the soil and the types of chemicals that might be used has shown that the number of species declines, but also there's an effect on what we're talking about, the nutrition in plants. I'm not sure if they actually measured that. They measured, you know, how much plant biomass you get or how much plant there is, yield. But I think that when you have a poorer soil, kind of a depauperate soil, it is much harder to provide all the ecosystem services, everything from storing carbon to cleansing water, to do all those tasks at once if they're missing players. And I think we just have to look above ground to see, okay, what happens when we start losing biodiversity above ground? You know, it affects human health and air and that sort of thing. So I think having healthy soils that have all the components there to give us the services we need as people and life on Earth to subsist is really important.
Yeah, that's just it in a nutshell, isn't it? Is the services it provides, but the food, that's something that I have come across recently, is understanding, the two big forms of malnutrition across the world. Of course, some people don't have enough to eat, but equally important, some people don't have the right nutrients in their diet, and it comes back to the soil. If the soil microbiome, the living beasties in the soil, can't access the nutrients to provide to the plants, and they work in harmony with the fungi and the bacteria to do that, then they're not going to be in the plants. And it seems madness to me that we take vitamin and mineral supplements, we're producing these from raw mineral resources, but we haven't got that in the soil because we've killed some of the life, or maybe the minerals aren't available, but more likely we've killed some of those symbiotic relations between the microbiome and the plants. Yeah.
I'm going to leave a space and see if Wayne can talk or wants to talk.
Yeah, we appreciate your voice, but just jump in.
Yeah, I think that's really important points. And I think, perhaps I'm not the best person to speak to issues to do with food production, as I'm not really a crop scientist as such. I'm a plant community ecologist, but I think to me an important element of soil health in the context of COP26 and climate change is really about resilience. So having that high soil diversity, having that ability to change in response to disturbances or shocks, and allowing ecosystem functions and services to be maintained is really important in a healthy soil. And if you take the plant mycorrhizal fungal associations that are so important both for many crops and for most plant species, 80% of plant species form some kind of mycorrhizal association with arbuscular, ericoid, or ectomycorrhizal fungi. Those mycorrhizal fungi are thought to be really important in helping to buffer plants from changes in their environment. So they can help with dealing with drought situations. They can help with increasing the ability to take up nutrients from the soil. So as climate changes, those mutualisms with mycorrhizal fungi in the soil are probably going to become really, really important. So we need to preserve that mycorrhizal diversity in order to preserve that symbiosis going forward.
Yeah, when you say resilience to an engineer, I'm thinking about climate change adaptation and water storage, for drought and flood, as you say, but I don't think about the resilience that the soil has because of its diversity of biology. And so, that it's working together on that, is so important. I'm just looking at the questions, guys, and I see that Laura has to leave in half an hour and has posed a question, and Roger also. But I'm wondering, Laura, if you want to ask the question in person, just put your microphone on and your camera and ask it now, because I see that you have to leave a bit early. So it'd be great to have your question now.
Thank you, Karen. I'm very sorry for leaving earlier. So my question comes from an economist point of view, because I'm an economist myself, and I'm very interested in human activities and what is the relationship with these human economic activities such as agriculture to therefore soil, biodiversity and climate change. So if you could explain this connection, and perhaps to tell me as a non-expert whether for you agriculture overall is a problem for soil, therefore biodiversity and climate change, or perhaps it will offer a solution to those issues.
What an excellent question. I'm happy to have a first stab from a sort of engineering point of view, even though I'm obviously not an agriculturalist. So what we do understand, as Diana has said, is that the way we have been treating our soil for the last 2 generations, I suppose, and educating our farmers as well, is to produce food to the detriment of soil health. So I mean, we were all blindsided in a way, maybe apart from Rachel Carson in the 60s who wrote Silent Spring, but we were using chemicals in order to, as part of the Green Revolution, to produce huge amounts of food and fed a lot of people, and pesticides to control the things that we didn't want to eat our crops. But that, in conjunction with the move to monocultures, has really reduced the diversity that we've been talking about is really necessary in the soil for resilience to climate change. And so, yes, agriculture has been a problem. Economics comes into it in terms of, at the minute, our system is set up to, the agri-food system is set up to produce 10 or 12 crops, basically, that sustain the whole world. And we are not rewarding farmers for protecting the environment. We're moving in that direction, though. I'm sure Diana will be able to come in on maybe something that the states are doing. They're ahead of us on no-till, etc. But in the UK, I can say that we're moving towards an environmental land management system where, replacing the Common Agricultural Policy, having left Europe, we are looking to reward farmers for ecosystem service provision, as well as providing food. So the details aren't all ironed out yet, largely because one of the topics we'll come to soon is, how do you define soil health? How do you measure it? How do you have a baseline of what the ecosystem services are to start with, and then how farmers are improving it? But the economics are really important in the transition to more regenerative agriculture, as opposed to the intensive that we've talked about. So regenerative means working with nature, using fewer chemicals. Mm-hmm. Diana, did you want to come in on more of a United States perspective?
I certainly think that, one of the biggest challenges that we have globally is food for people. And that is going to depend on land that we've already degraded. We've degraded, and I can't tell you the number of years, but it's something the UN Convention on to combat desertification, what the Global Soil Partnership, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. There's many different global groups looking at how much land do we actually have left to grow food on, crops on. So that's one aspect, is just land mass that's available. But I think, to get to your question, for biodiversity, and this is from a report that just came out that was by the CBD, the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative, and 300 or more scientists contributed to it. One of the things we're missing is, what is the how would you value the ecosystem services that just come from soil and the interactions there? How would you value, preventing erosion or so that you could have food where, it's produced with all the nutrients there, rather than them being washed or blown away? That's what erosion does, is it takes away from this healthy soil. Mm-hmm. I would say that right now, we are all looking, no matter what country, we're thinking about food production sustainably for the type of ecosystem we live in, whether it's arid or moist. And then, what have people learned in areas, say they're very wet now, and they're going to a drought? What do they see with drought? So there's lots of experiments going on in agriculture with chambers that keep rain out, so we can see what happens to the plants in the soil when a drought is imposed on that, even though it may have been wetter. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Laura, but I think it's so critical that we know how agriculture responds, soils respond, and the plants themselves to the various climate change scenarios that we're starting to see. Do we have less carbon stored? Do we, do the plants take up, to use more, or are they accelerated? What's going on with their physiology? And I think worldwide, the scientific community, with economists, it's taking all disciplines, is moving in that direction. That's just my view from where I come from.
Mm. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the Karen and Diana, and I agree. No market valuation, that's what we call no market valuation, is key in this debate to assess, yes, whether agriculture it's a problem or not, or it can be less of a problem. So thank you for highlighting that.
Thanks, Laura. Wayne, just put your hand up if you want to come in. I'm trying to protect your voice, but I think that I remain hopeful in as much as there seems now to be quite a big movement from big industry as well to embrace more regenerative agriculture practices. And we know that as a species, we take decades to enact change. And I feel that, I said at the start that these global challenges require interdisciplinarity. We need to work with the artists and humanities people and the social scientists to get the heart and soul of the public on board with soil and understand, the importance of soil in addressing climate change and food security, because it's the public, of course, and this is alluding to Roger's question. I see, Roger, I don't know if you want to come online and ask your question. I'm happy to read it out for you, but if you want to put your microphone on and camera, if you'd like, that would be great.
Yeah, I don't think I can add very much to what I've said in the chat. I mean, I'm somewhat pessimistic at the moment. We've got COP26 coming later this year, and I've been trying to encourage anybody who is interested in biodiversity and climate change to write to their MPs or their political representatives, whoever they may be, because if everybody on this forum this afternoon went carbon neutral right this very minute, it would make no real difference to the oncoming catastrophe at all. And we need international politicians to take real enforceable action. And that's only going to happen if people write to their MPs and tell them what they think. We've got to say COP26 coming in about 3 weeks' time. Then we've got, right at this moment, this week, we've got COP15 is going on, which is to do with the United Nations Conference on Biodiversity. Hardly seen a mention of it in any of the news media at all. And yet it's crucially important for the kind of things we're talking about this afternoon.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic point. And I think sometimes people can feel a bit powerless, as you suggested, even if we all went carbon neutral. But I do like to think that bottom-up approach is as important as the top-down approach. But the top-down approach, as you suggest, is absolutely essential. We need political leadership, and we're looking for it, of course, at COP26, and all eyes will be on the UK. And I think your suggestion is a great one. I know that yesterday the tickets went on sale as well for the general public to go to COP26. You can find the link online. I think it's a first come, first served, which maybe will mean that it'll be academics and policymakers and not the general public. So I'd really encourage anybody who to spread the word so that people can attend COP26 either virtually or in person. But writing, as you say, is powerful as well, and raising the issue of biodiversity as well as climate change, because there is a huge overlap, and something that we're interested in discussing if you've got any questions in that area between biodiversity and climate change. For example, as an engineer, we know that the science is very complex because soil is a living system. So just like human health, it's difficult to define soil health, and we can talk about the definitions, how we define it, and we need that metric in order to have a system to reward landowners and farmers for their better treatment of the land. But ultimately, we need to change hearts and minds, as I say, and I always feel that engineers are looking for the solutions to treat soil better. Do we know enough already to add organic matter to soils, potentially with minerals, is what my research is about, to stabilize the carbon and store carbon in the soil? What effect will that have on the biodiversity? I think that there's a lot of science still to be done, but we kind of need answers now. So this is, I think, raising awareness with politicians and telling them that the public is passionate about this subject and we're concerned is really important, Roger.
You see, I don't think we're really getting the message over. I mean, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has said that there are 502 species of vertebrates that have gone extinct in the modern era, and there are another 420 which are critically endangered. People don't realise that in some cases there's only 30 or 40. I mean, some of those 420 might actually already be extinct. When they were last assessed, there was only just a few, 2 or 3 of them in some cases. And we all depend on the health of the soil and so forth, and all these animals, and all these 500 and something have gone extinct, at least in part, because of human activity.
Absolutely. And I think the point that you raise, I might put to the panel, and then we'll look at, here we've got a question from Ed and from H. Harvey as well. But it's an excellent question about biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity for planetary health and human health. Is this a bigger issue than climate change? How does it link in? We've talked about as a group before online about the fact that can we both meet net zero and put carbon in the soil and achieve biodiversity at the same time? But how do we balance that? So Diana, would you like to comment on?
Take it on. I don't know if I have the answers, but I think what Roger has brought up is a very critical, urgent. It's absolutely urgent. It's that we talk to our policymakers and we move in as many direct ways as we can to influence that this our life depends on this. What is going on at COP26 and how we choose to manage nature to store carbon. It has an effect on wildlife. It has effect because, I think back to this. So they estimate that now we estimate that 25% of biodiversity is below ground. Now, that was, when I started out, I said, these are all the 5 factors that form soil, but only one of them is biodiversity. So if 25% of that is below ground, we know that it is the connections above ground, like these extinct species. How many of the extinct species, the birds, the bears, the squirrels, the whatever you want to have some food in soil. So they're really the top of the food chain. That's a link from animals to food in the soil, other animals. So those food chains are directly linked. We talk about, and Wayne has brought up, the mycorrhizae, these tubes in the soil that are absorbing and they're searching out and getting nutrients, but they're intimately tied to what we see above ground. 80%, he said, of the plant species. So this above ground, below ground, when we manage only for above ground and cut off what's below ground, the connections are gone. And so not only the connections to, the food web, but the connections to moving carbon above and below ground. So biodiversity and loss of biodiversity above ground or below ground is going to affect what's happening with COP26. I think the results there was a report from the Intergovernmental Panel of Ecosystem Services. I think it's called IPBS for another acronym, but they made it clear. One guy had been chair of the IPCC before. He was now chair of this intergovernmental panel looking at what kind of ecosystem services. And the results were, they said, these things are unified. We can't separate nature. You can't remove carbon from the air without thinking what we're doing to managing life above ground, affecting below ground.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that gets at everything that you were mentioning, the balance. I'm not sure about the balance, but we've got, and I actually would like to, maybe I'm too optimistic, but it seems like the growers here, and we have a lot of managers for the forest and the Rockies, we're concerned about water. There used to be lots of mines here back in the days of the gold rush. And of course, those are deteriorating. So there's a lot of interest in both managers and growers, the range people that have cattle. All of them are thinking much more, how can we be sustainable in our practices and still have an economic life?
Yeah.
And that tied with COVID is a huge question.
It is, and I think that this is the link between soil and food security and biodiversity, is that carbon, that movement of carbon, as you say, because if we think since the start of the Industrial Revolution, when you look at the increasing carbon emissions that have come from industrialization and industrialized farming, it's 2/3 of those global greenhouse gas emissions have come from fossil fuels, but 1/3 in total ever have come from land use change, degrading soils, cattle emissions, etc. So it links into food security. But the soil is not sexy. We know, I said it's not glamorous. And so what we're trying to do, some academics, based at Durham, but also at Stirling and the University of Zimbabwe, is come up with a mechanism to engage educational resources, basically, but not just education for kids, education for adults as well, because none of us have been taught the importance of soil. And we don't teach our engineers who design our built environments enough about the importance of soil, because underneath all our buildings is a material that is trying to be soil, even though we've bashed it and compressed it in order to build on it. So what we've got some workshops running, and one of the webinars is on building terrariums. It's basically a jam jar full of soil with plants, but it's more exciting than that scientifically, because it is what's called a energetically open, because the sunshine can get in for photosynthesis, but materially closed system because it's airtight. So we can kind of count the carbon atoms, study the water cycle, etc., look at what wants to grow, look at the microbiome in those systems. But with the kids, of course, and also me, my house is full of them, you can get your hands dirty and engage with that nurturing soil, because I think that's what we're missing from the education system, is an awareness that the environment, we are part of the environment, we have to look after it. So it'd be interesting to lead into, I think, mentioned circular economy there. I see there's a question from Ed. I don't know if you want to ask that, Ed. I recognize Ed's name. Ed works for the water industry. So and in our work at Durham, we've been using waste materials, clean waste products from the water industry. Ed, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. It was just a straightforward question about recycling treated sewage sludge to agriculture, which is something we do. 100% of our sludge gets recycled to land, and obviously it's great for the carbon. We don't really concentrate on the soil as such. What we're looking at is, are we complying with the legislation? So, for instance, the legislation in this country is based on the 1989 sludge use in agriculture, for instance. And there's, what we do is we analyse metals in soil and we look at the nutrients in a vague sort of way, but that's it. So there must be more required. I just thought, I think
so. I think that, of course, that organic matter has come from us. It's our waste product, isn't it? And it's part of soil's circular economy. And when I say circular economy, I mean, an economy is just a management of resources, isn't it? That we take resources from the ground, we produce products, and the wastes in our linear economy we throw away. But in the circular economy we're proposing having, which natural ecosystems do, they're reused as resources. And so soil needs that organic matter, and it also needs the micronutrients that are present. But because of our industrialized economy, then we have some potentially toxic elements in there that we have to be aware of. But there are methods, I think, for engineers to work with soil scientists, and this is what we're doing, to optimize those wastes, combining them with other materials like minerals that also are missing from the soil because of the floods and the droughts that we have, the water erosion and the wind erosion, and put them back in optimized form in order to rebuild the soil. So I think it's a really important question, adding those materials back to the soil.
I think an important caveat, though, if I can add that, is to think about it at a landscape scale as well, because I'm not sure how nitrogen rich these sewage sludge treatments are, but if they are very high in labile nitrogen, so nitrates, nitrites, ammonium, then you're going to potentially get quite a bit of leaching into watercourses, which obviously has its biodiversity impacts downstream, as it were. And it can lead to potentially shifts in the nature of the microbial community in the soil itself. So as you increase the amount of nitrogen in soil relative to carbon, you can get shifts towards a more bacterial dominated system, which might be quite resilient in the face of disturbances further down the line, but may also be less resistant to excuse me, it's going may also be less resistant in the long run. So I think we do need to think about the way we treat soils with fertilizers very carefully in a joined up landscape way. And
absolutely, and the legislation isn't there to support us at the minute. As Ed says, my understanding, and obviously Ed, you're the expert here, but is that it's very risk averse, because we've come at it from what's the bad stuff in this waste. We see wastes as bad instead as potential resources that can be optimized to return to the land. And it's not a panacea. Some waste, of course, can't be returned to the land. And as you say, you've got to look at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. But there are things that can be done, either further treatment or adding other materials that get that balance correct. And really, it does involve, going back to sort of Laura's question of economics, it involves a whole different set of economics to reward the circular economy. And, you know, even go as an engineer, you know, working in a general engineering department with electronic engineers, mechanical engineers, we need to be training our engineers, which I try to train them in this, that they're in charge of the process line, producing the product, but not just a product, another byproduct, which might in a previous day have been seen as a waste. But please make sure that byproduct is something that in some process can be returned to the land, because in many cases it can, certainly, of course, in the construction industry. And we're starting to do that in some cases, but all of our legislation is very risk averse, and we need policy changes in order to enable us to use these clean wastes to rebuild soils, while, of course, keeping an eye on water quality, as you say.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Karen.
I see another question. So we've got from H. Harvey, sensitive farming. Would you like to ask that question? I don't know what the H stands for, or would you like me to ask it for you? Sensitive farming and farming stewardship is excellent and raises awareness to the farmers. A lot has already happened. It's still being put into place. I think it's a very exciting time, but what I feel frustrated by is that there's a growing awareness of the importance of soil health. And like Diana said, in the States, you know, that there's a movement and there's big industry interested. But to me, there's a tipping point needs to be reached, a bit like was reached with plastics pollution to a certain extent when David Attenborough released that photograph. I can't remember the name of the artist, but the one of the seahorse with his tail wrapped around the cotton bud. And it was a bit of a moment. So this was a seahorse living in the sea that had wrapped its tail around a plastic earbud. And now all earbuds that I've seen for sale have got cardboard. And it's a small thing in a way. I know we've still got a huge marine plastics problem, but we need that image for soil. We need something for soil, or else we use the proxy, you know, the tardigrade. Diana, I'm thinking about your attractive beasties that look like this bear that live in the soil, and they're tiny, but they're amazing looking beasties. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that point. There is so much happening, but I feel that it's a regional level and nothing has gone national and global yet. And that, you know, send me your ideas, you know, for images, you know, put it on Twitter or whatever. I think we need something to engage people. And we're working on the terrariums on that. I see there's one from Emily. Emily, would you like to ask the question? Hi.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my question is, one of the things that scientists tell us that we need to eat a more plant-based diet in order to help with greenhouse gas emissions. But I've often wondered if our soils will be able to handle a transition to a completely plant-based diet. There's some crops like potatoes, for example, that heavily till the soil And I imagine if we were to transition to a plant-based diet, that we'd have to, I don't know, add a lot to the soil, because we'd probably be farming in places that probably aren't suitable for vegetable production. So I guess I just want to hear from all of you, how would transitioning to a plant-based diet affect the soil?
I think that's an excellent question. I'm happy to start answering that and give my perspective. I think you're raising potatoes. That's the huge one, isn't it? You have to dig the potatoes up, you have to till. And I think that there are mechanisms of putting some bales on top, you know, to have the darkness and the moist conditions. I have to put my hands up. This is absolutely not my area of expertise. We're just having a conversation. But my understanding is that we will use less land. It's more efficient to produce plants directly than to, you know, produce the soya and the crops to feed the animals. And that even with the current state of affairs where we eat too much meat, then we have enough food to feed people, but we're not using the land efficiently, both in terms of water use, or the soil is not as productive as it could be because of all the reasons that we talked about. So the ambition is, but I don't know the figures to answer your question, Emily, I'm sorry. But my understanding is that we can feed as many people, and in fact, the 10 billion that we're moving towards, I'm taking this information from people like Ratan Lal, you know, who knows a lot more about this and has studied it a lot more than certainly than I have. We can feed that many people moving towards a plant-based diet if we prioritize plant health and have more diverse cropping, move slightly away, not in every case, but from monocultures. But that transition needs this change of heart. It needs economic, it needs a transition from governments to actually enable businesses and create that green economy, not just in the energy sector for renewables, but in land and in soil health. And so it's not an easy transition.
I would just like to add to this. And again, I want to give a caveat. This is not my field, but I also know that here where we have cattle, a lot of cattle on the range, you know, home on the range kind of thing. There is a lot of discussion going on, both with what types of microbes in food can we feed to cattle so they don't emit so much methane and other gases. What is the comparison to feedlots where they have them lined up in, you know, near cities and versus and may use that manure to put back out into the fields, that sort of thing, concentrated versus more sustainable. I know this sounds crazy, but sustainable cattle, you know, how much range and that sort of thing. How much can they reduce that so that we do have plant-based food to maybe even help switch the balance to that? And then I think a whole lot of people are thinking here, how much land can we leave just in conservation, you know, sustainable, just sitting while we have cattle grazing in different areas. I mean, there is some research that shows grazing changes some of the soil organism food webs. For the good or the bad, I'm not sure. We have antelope out here too, still, that, you know, we see across the range mixed with cattle. And I think about in countries like Africa, where they may depend on a cow in the backyard and more small sustainable farming. It's not quite the same issue as it is mass producing cows or meat, pigs, whatever, for people. But I think people are looking at it from both the animal side, I should say, and from how much plant does it take. So I'll quit there because I see somebody wants to make a comment. They may know more than I do.
Yeah, Elaine, if you've got a comment, Emily will invite you to respond as well. Please keep your camera on.
Okay, thanks. I'm just coming at this from we do quite a lot of research have done on using insects as a source of nutrition for animal feed. And within that, there's a whole world of LCA analysis around comparing insects with cattle, with soya. I think the main comment is, yes, I agree with what's been said. We have got enough land. The problem is the energy loss, the energy efficiency. You grow an acre of soya and that only feeds, I don't know, a chicken for a day or whatever. So it's more around the monogastrics, around pigs and poultry, that we can make the massive difference in terms of land mass. I'm not a kind of ecologist at all. I'm looking at it from the entomology point of view. What I would say personally is what concerns me about this push for plant-based food, I'm a vegetarian myself, is that it's all processed. So you now walk into Marks and Spencer's and there's lines and lines of processed plant protein, when actually we need to be just cooking more vegetables.
Yeah.
So that's what worries me, is the energy impacts of all that processing actually may end up being better eating a steak, a few veggie burgers.
Yeah, and I think it's exciting as well to remember that in a natural, prairie, to take the example sort of system, then the large herbivores, which would have been present in the UK before they went extinct, larger herbivores have a very important role in the ecosystem in terms of eating some of the vegetation and putting more carbon into the soil. Again, I don't know anything about this, but that integrated arable, the crops and livestock, but eating less meat. Clearly, we've become, particularly in the global north, very adept at having meat every day, every other day, even if we're trying to move towards a vegetarian diet, and it's just not very efficient, as you say. But the insects is fascinating, and also eating insects as well, of course, Elaine, seems to be on the agenda as well.
Yeah, I can't talk to eating insects directly as a vegetarian. I just can't conceptually get it. But I think it's taking off more in places like Holland.
Wayne, I see that you're unmuted.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the point about growing things in places where you wouldn't normally choose to grow them. I think maybe that's something we have to try to get away from and be a lot more careful and selective about, where we grow certain crops, where they're, most optimal in terms of the yield that they're going to produce, and also in terms of the ecosystem impacts that they're going to have. But I also think the issue on tilling or not tilling is really interesting. I think it's important to realise that there are costs to no-till agriculture as well. So frequently herbicides are used because weed infestation in no-till systems is a problem. So you're kind of trading off saving your soil biodiversity, particularly the large invertebrates, against using herbicides, which may have impacts on above ground species. So there's no kind of one way of doing it which is going to be good for everything. I think we just have to be careful what we do and where.
Yeah, I remember Ratan Lal, the last time I heard him speak, talking about the difference between medicine and poison is the dose. And so it's like not one extreme or the other, but we use far too much, of course, to the benefit of agribusiness, chemicals at the moment, and using quite a bit less is definitely the way forward. Emily, I said if you wanted to come back on anything, are there any comments you wanted to make?
No, thank you for your responses. I guess I've been thinking about what you've said about educating people on these issues of soil health, and I'm from an agricultural community in the United States, and I think of going back and telling farmers or people I interact with at home about some of these issues, and this is a question that they often ask me that I don't know how to answer, because they graze cattle on federal land, and anyways, it's that land can't be used for anything else because anyway, so I was just curious.
That's fascinating to hear what community you're from, because I haven't spoken to many farmers, but I've spoken to a few from Europe and a few from the States, and they're all, maybe I'm in my own little echo chamber, of course, they're all very excited about regenerative agriculture, but most of them are very keen to keep hold of glyphosate because of the issues that Wayne talks about, because it's economically, there's just not the labor available to do the weeding that is required for, fully going organic. And the final point, I think, that makes me think of your question, Emily, is that actually we might not need soil to produce as much food in the future, you know, thinking 30, 40, 50 years in the future with the more processed food that Elaine talks about, but maybe we can do that in a, you know, fueled by renewable energy. I don't know, that's not my area of expertise. Hydroponics or whatever seems very unsustainable to me at the moment, but if it was all fueled with wind and solar, etc. But we'll always need soil health. We'll always need soil health to underpin human health and provide antibiotics, the next generation of antibiotics, to provide carbon storage, of course, and land for us to enjoy, and water storage. So I think that's, yeah.
I think that I would just add one thing, is that what we're seeing growers around here are, they've got it, that climate change is happening here. And so the biggest number one worry they're seeing is we're going to be in a severe drought that may not be able to, well, it's certainly going to change the above ground cattle industry. The water is a huge issue here, because I don't even want to go into it. It's just absolutely huge, but we have water. I mean, that's what we're all living and dying on. So you put those two things together, and the awareness in the community, not only cities, but in agricultural communities and the tourism business here, all are affected by climate change. And so there's much more on climate smart agriculture. Will we be growing cattle somewhere else, you know, in 20 years, because it's so hot across the southern US? There's lots of this discussion on climate smart agriculture, and that's where soil health really comes in. Will the soils be able, we may be asking here to do crops that we haven't been doing. So are we going to go at a different type of more resistant to drought crop than we have in the past? It's all being looked at in many different discussions.
Yeah, it's a very exciting point, the developing crops. I mean, of course, the indigenous crops that grow in the dry parts of the world, you know, I'm thinking of my colleagues in Zimbabwe, you know, have developed some fantastic plant improvement technologies, we call them, where they are growing weeds, basically indigenous legumes that fix the nitrogen, and not only fix a certain amount of nitrogen in the soil by digging in those legumes after they've grown, but they actually enhance the nitrogen cycle, and have seen some really impressive results with climate smart agriculture using women in the communities in farmer learning centers they know the weeds and identify the ones that grow best in drought conditions, and have them as their sort of fallow crop, as it were, and digging them into the soil. And the solutions are all there. That's, you know, and countries have come up with the solutions. It's just how to spread it across nationally and globally. I think we're running out of time. I could just keep this conversation going, and please do stay in touch. My emails are available, I think, on the website, as are Diana's and Wayne's. With any thoughts you have. I think it is time to wrap up. I just love the fact that Helen, thanks for letting us know that you were in the hairdressers. I'm really excited that you attended, even though that you were at the hairdressers. So thanks for joining us. And thanks so much for all your questions. This recording will be available to watch in about a week's time. So as I say, just Google STEAM for ACE, Durham University, and you'll also see the other webinars that we've had, that Laura Marciliani ran some on finance, and we've also had some on energy. So thank you very much, and I will close the session. Thanks so much, though, before I go, to Diana and to Wayne, particularly with your voices going. I heard yours as well, Diana, at the end, but Wayne, get well soon. So thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Karen.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.